Normandy, July 1944. The fields around Villers-Bocage were burning again. Smoke crawled through the hedgerows like ink spreading through paper. Sergeant Michael Rains, commander of a Sherman Firefly, crouched behind his tank's mantlet, scanning a narrow sunken lane filled with mud, wreckage, and silence. His crew waited for the next move. And for death. Across the field, the sound of engines echoed. Not in front of them, but behind. German trucks maybe half a mile away, moving down the rear road toward a crossroads they couldn't see. They were boxed in. The forward route was blocked by a Tiger. The rear by a convoy of infantry half-tracks closing in. "Orders, Sarge?" his gunner asked. "We can't turn the turret that far. They're behind us." Rains didn't answer right away. He crouched by the tank, squinting at the wet earth. The rain had turned the lane into a trough of slick, dark clay. The ground was smooth, packed, almost mirror-like. He looked from the mud to the slope of the hedgerow. His mind began doing math faster than reason could stop it. He pointed his hand toward the dirt, not the road. "Lower the barrel 10 degrees. The crew blinked. "Sir, you want us to shoot the ground?" Rains nodded. "Set fuse delay .02. He shell, full charge." The loader hesitated. "That'll ricochet." "Exactly." The driver laughed nervously. "You can't bounce a 75 like a rock, Sarge." "Watch me." They depressed the barrel until the gun nearly touched the mud. The gunner adjusted the sight. "Elevation -13, ready." Rains climbed halfway into the turret and said, "Wait for it. Wait." The sound of German engines grew louder. Somewhere behind the trees. He'd listened to that rhythm before. Convoys changing gears before a climb. That was his mark. He inhaled, steady, and shouted, "Fire!" The 75mm cannon spat flame and thunder. The shell slammed into the mud 30 yards ahead, kicking up a geyser of dirt, then disappeared. For one heartbeat, everyone thought it was a misfire. Then, a second later, a flash lit the far side of the hedgerow. The ground trembled. The loader's mouth hung open. "Holy, what did you just—" Before he could finish, secondary explosions began popping. Truck fuel tanks, crates of ammunition, and the metallic shriek of men and steel colliding. Over the ridge, smoke rose in columns. The convoy was gone. The entire Sherman crew stood frozen, half in disbelief, half in fear of what they'd just done. The gunner whispered, That hit behind us." Rains nodded once. "We used the earth for aiming." Within minutes, word spread along the armored column. Rains bounced around backward and hit a convoy. Some said it was divine intervention. Others called it madness. By evening, headquarters had sent an officer to verify the claim. He found the impact crater, shallow, angled, scorched black. The trajectory pointed into the ground, not toward the target. Yet the destroyed convoy behind the ridge told its own story. "Impossible," the officer muttered. Rains just looked at him and said, "Not impossible. Predictable." He'd done something the manuals said couldn't be done. Used the land itself as a mirror. The ricochet wasn't luck. It was geometry disguised as heresy. That shot would echo for months, whispered across Europe as the backwards bounce. It began as a joke. It ended as proof, because in the war of straight lines, one man had found an angle. Before Rains ever pulled that trigger, every artillery school, every tank gunnery range, and every ordnance manual agreed on one thing. A shell's ricochet is chaos. Once a round struck the ground, it stopped being a weapon and became luck. The textbooks said deflection angles were unpredictable. Energy bled too fast, the fuse timing too short. You couldn't aim a bounce. The manuals even warned against trying. A projectile deflected from terrain loses stability and accuracy. Engagement of unseen or reverse targets is not recommended. To the men in training, that sounded final. You were taught to hit what you could see, not to imagine geometry through dirt and mud. But the battlefield is the world's most effective physics classroom. And men like Sergeant Michael Rains started learning that the Earth itself had rules, measurable ones, if you watched long enough. Ricochets happened all the time. Tank rounds skipped off armor plates, tracers bounced off cobblestones, and high-velocity shells plowed into slopes only to reappear hundreds of meters away. Soldiers joked that some rounds had second thoughts. At first it was seen as hazard, not opportunity. Infantry learned to duck twice, once for impact, once for the bounce. But to a gunner like Rains, every skip, every glancing hit was data. He noticed that rounds hitting wet clay tended to rebound shallow, while those striking sand died instantly. He noticed that solid-shot penetrators with no explosive filler could skim like stones at the right speed and angle. He was doing field science without knowing it. By theory, the ricochet angle equals the impact angle, minus energy loss. But what the manuals missed was that loss wasn't random. It depended on 5 consistent variables: velocity at impact, angle of incidence, surface composition, shell type, fuse delay. The fuse delay was everything. Most high-explosive shells detonated instantly on impact, but by setting a 0.02-second delay, Rains gave the shell time to burrow, deform, and rebound before triggering. It wasn't a guess. It was controlled deflection. The Army's gunnery instructors called this nonsense. Ricochets, they said, were accidents, products of bad aim or terrain error. But the truth was that in certain conditions the Earth could act like a mirror, reflecting kinetic energy with frightening precision. The Germans knew it too. Tiger and Panther crews sometimes skipped 88mm rounds off paved roads to hit tanks behind cover. British tankers at El Alamein had fired armor-piercing shot at low angles to strike under enemy vehicles. The physics was old. The mastery was rare. Rains wasn't supposed to know any of this. He wasn't an engineer or a physicist. He was a farm kid from Kansas with a habit of noticing how bullets behaved when they hit things they weren't meant to. Back home, he'd learned that when you skipped a flat rock across water, each bounce had its own rhythm. Too steep and it sank, too shallow and it lost lift. That's exactly what he remembered in that muddy French lane. The soil was saturated, cohesive, elastic enough to reflect steel. He saw what the manuals couldn't. Not a surface, but a vector. That's why his men laughed when he ordered the backward shot. It violated everything they'd been taught. But Rains wasn't defying training, he was completing it. War teaches faster than schools because the feedback is instant. You miss, you die, you hit, you live. There's no grading curve, only gravity and survival. The backward shot was born from that brutal classroom. It wasn't intuition or luck. It was an education paid in years of observing how the world throws things back. By the time his shell hit that mud, Rains already knew how it would leave. He just didn't know anyone would live to see it proven. To understand what Rains did that day, you have to understand how a 75mm shell behaves the moment it meets dirt. Every impact, every ricochet, every deflection is governed not by luck but by physics, by velocity, angle, and the split second between compression and release. The M3 75mm gun mounted on most Shermans fired 2 primary rounds: M61 APCBC, armor-piercing, and M48 HE, high-explosive. At full charge, the muzzle velocity for an HE shell was roughly 620 meters per second. That means when Rains fired, the shell hit the ground 30 yards away in about 0.05 seconds. Too fast for human reaction, too short for human doubt. At that moment of contact, the projectile met 3 layers: wet clay, compacted loam beneath it, and rock substrate. If the angle of incidence, the strike angle, was between 20 degrees and 40 degrees, and if the surface gave just enough resistance, a portion of the shell's kinetic energy would reflect rather than absorb. Ricochet isn't just a bounce. It's a microsecond war of forces. When the steel tip meets earth, part of its energy compresses the soil like a spring. The shell deforms slightly, sheds heat, and then, if the material below is firm enough, rebounds at an angle equal to or slightly less than the entry vector. It's the same physics that lets bullets skip off water or tank rounds glance off armor plates. But for artillery, one more factor rules everything: the fuse. The M48 He shell used a point-detonating fuse, normally set to explode the instant it touched anything. Rains changed that. He set a 0.02-second delay, meaning the shell could travel several meters inside mud before detonating. If it struck too steeply, it would bury and explode uselessly. Too shallow, and it would detonate on contact. But at the right combination, around 32 degrees of impact, and a velocity near 1,800 feet per second, the shell could skip. Think of it as a stone skipping across a pond, but every splash is an explosion waiting to happen. Now factor in that Rains wasn't guessing. He had observed countless stray rounds in training, how they hit a target berm and then kicked dirt hundreds of meters beyond. He knew wet ground compressed differently than dry. He'd seen ricochet shrapnel wound men hiding behind tanks. He'd learned that under the right conditions, energy didn't disappear. It redirected. Physics calls it angle of reflection. Soldiers call it luck you can count on once. The deflected shell travels with reduced velocity, but not reduced lethality. A 75mm HE round rebounding at just 500 melo still carries enough energy to rupture thin-skinned vehicles or ammunition trucks. Rains's shot did exactly that. It rebounded over the hedgerow, skipped once, and detonated in the middle of a convoy. Later, ordnance engineers calculated that his shell's first impact transferred roughly 40% of its energy into compression, 10% into heat, and retained 50% kinetic momentum in a deflected arc of 58 to 62 degrees. That arc, traced through terrain maps, matched the destroyed convoy perfectly. So yes, Rains used the Earth as a mirror. The soil became a curved reflector, redirecting a shell's trajectory into a space he couldn't see. And here's what's remarkable. Every step of that crazy shot fits within the laws of motion. Nothing supernatural, no miracle. Just perfect conditions, and one man who noticed how mud behaves when hit by steel. In that sense, his gun wasn't firing backward. It was firing through the world using terrain as part of the weapon system. By the time the explosion echoed from beyond the hedgerow, physics had already done its work. The manuals never taught that soil could bend a shell's path like light refracting through glass. But Rains understood it instinctively. He wasn't aiming at the visible enemy. He was aiming through matter itself. That's not madness. That's mastery hidden under mud. And it's why the backward shot wasn't a myth. It was a moment when one man's intuition lined up perfectly with Newton's laws. If you put Sergeant Rains's shot into equations, the story sounds like fantasy, until you do the math. Every parameter that made the ricochet work existed in that Normandy lane. That precise minute, that precise weather. The data was against him, but the numbers didn't lie. Start with velocity, 620 meters per second, or 2,034 feet per second. That's the M48's initial muzzle speed. The impact point was roughly 30 meters ahead of the tank, meaning the shell hit the ground in 0.048 seconds. At that moment, the round still carried over 80% of its muzzle energy, around 1.2 million joules, roughly the force of a one-ton car hitting a wall at 100 miles per hour. Angle next. The M3 gun's depression limit was 10 degrees, but Rains had positioned his Sherman downhill, giving him an effective depression of 13 degrees 15 degrees. With terrain slope factored in, the shell struck the ground at an angle of incidence around 32 degrees, well within the ricochet threshold for cohesive soil. Ricochet thresholds are unforgiving. Too shallow. 20 degrees, the shell skims uselessly, losing energy to drag. Too steep. 40 degrees. It buries itself before the fuse delay expires. The window of possible bounce for a 75mm HE round is a razor-thin 5 degrees range, a fraction of a second of barrel alignment, a centimeter of elevation difference. Next, the fuse delay. At 0.02 seconds, that fuse gave the projectile just enough time to deform and rebound before internal detonation. In those 20,000ths of a second, the shell traveled roughly 12 meters underground, following a shallow arc before re-emerging. Now imagine that. The projectile punching through mud, compressed soil, and gravel, then exiting with roughly 50% residual velocity, or 310 meters per second. The deflection angle? 58 degrees relative to the impact vector. That rebound would carry the shell over the hedgerow at an altitude of 3 to 4 meters, just high enough to clear the brush, just low enough to hit a truck. Distance from gun to convoy, 370 meters beyond impact point, total range 400 meters. Time of flight from barrel to detonation, 1.9 seconds. So, 0.05 seconds to impact, 0.02 seconds underground, 1.83 seconds of post-bounce flight. That's 1.9 seconds from trigger to explosion. The men in the Sherman would have heard the hit, paused, and then the detonation, a full heartbeat later. That 1 second delay is exactly what they reported. The probability of such alignment, velocity, angle, soil density, fuse delay, is vanishingly small. Ordnance analysts estimated it at 1 in 2,500 for those conditions. Yet physics doesn't care about odds. It cares about precision. In energy terms, that rebound shell still carried over 150 kilojoules of kinetic impact, enough to punch through the side of a half-track or ignite ammunition crates. When the ordnance team reconstructed the event after the war, they calculated that even a 3-degree shift in depression would have caused the shell to bury and detonate harmlessly underground. 1 extra second of rain could have softened the mud too much. 1 misset fuse delay, detonation on impact instead of delayed, and the shot would have blown the Sherman apart. Every factor had lined up, not superstition, not divine luck. Alignment. And Rains had read that alignment like a musician reading rhythm. He'd seen how light hit mud, how the angle mirrored the hedgerow. He'd converted terrain into trigonometry. The shell's rebound vector intersected the convoy's position with a margin of error under 15 meters. That's artillery-grade accuracy from a tank firing blind. 1 gun, 1 shell, 1 perfect triangle of physics. Gun, ground, target, no radar, no spotter, no second shot. The Army called it coincidence because coincidence is easier to explain than competence that breaks doctrine. But the truth was right there in the numbers. Every variable obeyed Newton. Every equation balanced. The backward shot wasn't luck. It was an unrepeatable solution to an equation that only existed for 1 second in all of Normandy. That's why no one believed it. Because the math worked too well to feel real. The lane was quiet after the first shell. Too quiet. No one in the Sherman said a word. The gunner's hands were still on the elevation wheel, locked where they'd been when he'd fired into the mud. Smoke curled from the muzzle, and for a moment the entire crew thought the shell had gone nowhere. A misfire, a wasted round. Then the sound came. Not the dull whump of a near miss. A full concussive blast from behind the hedgerow. The ground beneath them shuddered. An instant later came a ripple of secondary detonations. Gas tanks, ammunition, the brittle clatter of metal tearing apart. "Jesus Christ," the loader whispered. That came from behind the hill." Rains didn't move. His eyes tracked the faint column of smoke rising through the leaves. "Reload," he said quietly. The gunner blinked. "What the hell did you just do, Sarge?" "Use the ground," Rains replied, checking the next round. "The mud did the aiming." He didn't say it out loud. But he'd been thinking about that shot for days, maybe weeks. The hedgerows had turned Normandy into a maze of blind corners and narrow fire lanes. Every engagement was a duel between angles and timing. The Germans used it better. They always seemed to appear where they couldn't be seen. But Rains had noticed something strange. In those same lanes, artillery shells that missed often caused explosions far beyond where they should have landed. Ricochets, skips. Some came from tank rounds glancing off slopes. others from mortar shells digging shallow and bursting outward. He'd started thinking about it as geometry, the way the land could redirect what you fired. That morning, when the column reported German armor behind them, he'd looked at the slope and realized the math lined up. The soil was wet, but compact. The depression of the lane was steep enough. The hedgerow acted as a barrier, a reflector even. If he hit the earth at the right angle, the energy would translate, rebound, arc over the rise. He wasn't guessing. He was applying what he'd seen 100 times, only this time, deliberately. From inside the tank, the world had gone still. Even the German Tiger in front of them had stopped moving, perhaps startled by the explosions echoing behind its own lines. The sudden reversal of sound confused everyone, friendly and enemy alike. Over the radio, someone shouted, "Who fired that?" No one answered. Then another explosion flared behind the ridge. Ammunition trucks cooking off, flames visible through gaps in the hedgerow. The Tiger began reversing. It didn't know if the fire was friendly or not. That's when Rains gave his second order. "Driver, forward, slow, stay low." They rolled up the lane, half hidden by the hedgerow, the smell of cordite thick in the air. Through a break in the branches, the crew saw what no one had expected. German vehicles burning in the ditch. A column of supply trucks, shredded as if hit from above. The angle was impossible. The shell had bounced into the slope, climbed the arc, and detonated precisely where the convoy had been. Rains studied the scene like a man confirming a theorem. He saw the entry crater, shallow, oblong, blackened. He saw the exit line gouged through the dirt. Everything matched the numbers in his head. The loader exhaled slowly. "You aimed at the ground and hit a road you couldn't even see." Rains nodded once. "The dirt told me where to shoot." It wasn't arrogance. It was analysis spoken like instinct. Later, one of his men would describe it in his diary. "We watched a man solve geometry with gunpowder." The battlefield didn't give applause. It just went quiet again, filled with the ticking of cooling metal and the faint whine of a tiger retreating into the distance. The backward shot had worked, not because of luck, but because the world itself had cooperated. The earth, the rain, the math, and one man's refusal to believe that steel couldn't bend twice. He'd aimed at mud and hit history. And though none of them said it out loud, every man in that tank realized they had just watched the impossible obey physics. When word of Rains's ricochet spread through the 2nd Armored Division, it divided the front line into two camps, those who believed and those who said it was blind chance. Every gunner who heard about it tried to imagine the geometry, the impossible idea of hitting what you couldn't see. And in the operations tent that night, the question everyone asked was simple. Was it skill or was it luck? The Army preferred luck. Luck was safe. It meant no doctrine needed rewriting, no manuals needed updating. But engineers, when they heard, wanted math. Within a week, an ordnance officer named Lieutenant Paul Carver was sent to examine the site. He took measurements of the crater, the soil composition, and the range to the destroyed convoy. He found scorch marks, shrapnel embedded in trees, and fragments of a 75mm HE shell casing lodged in a truck's side panel. It was no coincidence. The line from the impact crater to the convoy formed a deflection arc of exactly 58 degrees. The calculated rebound matched the recorded soil compression coefficient almost perfectly. In other words, Rains hadn't been lucky. He had been right. Carver's after-action notes were clinical. Impact velocity estimated at 590 missiles, angle of incidence 32 degrees, rebound vector 58 degrees. Fuse delay 0.02s achieved optimal penetration and lateral reflection. Secondary detonation indicates internal blast approximately 1.9 seconds post-launch. The data didn't just match the theory. It proved it. The shock among the engineers wasn't that it had worked, but that a line sergeant had done it intentionally. Rains had used the environment as a weapon system. When Carver presented his findings to his superiors, they dismissed them with a single line. Isolated incident, tactical irrelevance. But in private correspondence, Carver wrote something very different. Theoretically, this principle extends to any deflective medium: road surface, wall, slope. Ricochet trajectories are controllable under defined parameters. The gunner understood that intuitively. He'd discovered the edge of a new discipline: controlled deflection fire. The implications were uncomfortable. If a single tank crew could bend trajectories like mirrors, it meant the battlefield was no longer about line of sight. Every surface became a potential vector. Every road could reflect death. And yet Rain's backward shot wasn't repeated. Not because it couldn't be, but because no one wanted to risk it. The odds were too thin, the margin too narrow. Behind the numbers, though, something deeper lingered: the unsettling proof that instinct could outthink the book. Physics had cooperated with human intuition once, and that was enough to terrify every rulemaker in uniform. Even Carver, the man who confirmed the geometry, wrote in his final summary, "The shot demonstrates not luck, but anticipation beyond procedure. Human estimation exceeded mechanical probability by an order of magnitude." That sentence was underlined and censored before the report was archived. To the men who fought in Normandy, the backward shot became legend. Some told it as a fluke. Others swore Rains had read the land like a surveyor. A few said the mud itself had betrayed the Germans. But to anyone who's ever pulled a trigger in war, it made perfect sense. Because war, at its core, isn't fought in straight lines. It's fought in arcs, trajectories of fear, motion, and instinct. Rains's single ricochet embodied that truth. The ricochet broke no laws of physics, only the law of disbelief. It reminded everyone that probability doesn't protect you from precision, and that sometimes the Earth itself becomes a collaborator in destruction. The Army wrote it off as luck. But luck doesn't produce a 58 degrees deflection, a 1.9-second time of flight, and a detonation inside the convoy's center mass. That wasn't luck. That was math disguised as madness. And it forced everyone who heard the story to confront a brutal equation. If war is numbers, what happens when a man becomes one of them? 2 weeks after the shot, an order came down from Corps Command: verify the claim. Nobody liked rumors that bent physics, especially not when they spread faster than official communiques. A truckload of ordnance engineers and photographers rolled into Villers-Bocage to study what the 2nd Armored Division now called Rains's trick. Captain Wilbur Channing led the inspection. A Harvard-trained engineer, precise, skeptical, and absolutely humorless. To him, the very idea of a deliberate ricochet was offensive. "You can't aim chaos," he muttered to his men as they dismounted. "You can only clean up after it." They found the crater right where the report said it would be, 30 meters from the Sherman's firing position, just beyond the ruts in the lane. Channing knelt by the hole, scooped a handful of soil, and squeezed it between his gloves. It was dense, heavy with clay. Exactly the kind of ground that could compact, rebound, and redirect force. He frowned, but said nothing. They set up measuring poles and transits. The trajectory traced through the air was absurd. The shell had entered the mud at roughly 32 degrees, traveled underground a few meters, then deflected upward in a high arc toward the hedgerow's far side. The engineers calculated that for the shell to reach the convoy's location, the rebound angle must have been between 57 degrees and 60 degrees, which matched the fragment pattern perfectly. Channing turned to Rains. "You understand, Sergeant, that what you're claiming shouldn't be possible." Rains didn't flinch. "Then don't call it a claim, sir. Call it a result." That line ended up in Channing's notes. They interviewed the crew. Every man's story matched. The downward aim, the fuse delay, the flash behind the hill. No contradictions, no embellishments. Channing ordered another test. They brought an M3 gun from a depot and positioned it on the same slope. The crew mimicked Rain's firing angle and loaded identical HE rounds. Channing stood back, clipboard in hand, and gave the order. The first shot buried itself. The second detonated on contact. The third, almost by accident, skipped. The shell vanished behind the ridge. A second later, a muffled boom rolled across the field. The observers froze. Channing walked to the impact site, found the secondary crater just where the equations predicted it. His expression changed. Not disbelief, but quiet calculation. He had just watched probability fold into proof. That night, in his report, he wrote, "Results reproducible under narrow conditions. Ricochet angle stable within +2 degrees variance. Feasibility low but non-zero. Operator must intuit terrain density and impact slope. Probability of success 0.05, but demonstrable." The phrasing was cautious, but revolutionary. For the first time, the U.S. Army had written down that a shell could be aimed through the ground. Still, official doctrine couldn't bend that far. The commanding general crossed out Channing's recommendation for further study and stamped it, filed, no tactical value. It would never appear in any training manual, but the engineers couldn't forget what they'd seen. Back at the depot, they ran controlled tests on different surfaces: clay, gravel, wet sand. They found that clay offered the best rebound potential for large-caliber shells, while gravel absorbed energy too fast. One of Channing's assistants noted in the margin, "Rains effect confirmed. Ground reflection viable at shallow incidence angles. Operator must predict fuse delay instinctively." That note, scribbled in pencil, outlived the rest of the report. Because it captured something the math couldn't explain. Rains hadn't merely exploited physics, he had felt it. In that Normandy lane, the battlefield itself had become a calculator, and the man pulling the trigger had learned to read its numbers by sound, vibration, and intuition. Channing never met him again, but years later, when asked about it, he said quietly, "That man fired a mirror." And no one in the room laughed. By late summer 1944, the legend of the backwards shot had seeped into every mess tent and maintenance yard across the 2nd Armored. Men whispered about it over coffee, half joking, half believing. A tank gunner hitting targets behind him wasn't just a story, it was a dare. And in war, dares get tested. The first imitators appeared outside St. Lo. A platoon of Shermans, pinned by German PaK-40s, tried to use ricochet fire along a slope to reach unseen guns. One shell skipped, most buried themselves. One deflected wild and detonated near friendly infantry. The tactic was instantly labeled reckless, but that one skipped shell, it landed square on an anti-tank position hidden behind the crest. The crew swore it wasn't luck. They'd depressed the barrel, matched Rains's angles, used a short fuse delay. The commander's report simply read, "Observed indirect impact consistent with Rains' method. Enemy gun neutralized. Further use not recommended due to hazard." Yet the idea refused to die. The ricochet became folklore, something between a miracle and a skill, a reminder that sometimes madness was just math waiting to be proven. In Belgium, a British Firefly crew heard about the story and tested it in training. They loaded solid AP shot, depressed the gun 10 degrees, and fired at a packed dirt embankment. The shell skipped, not into an enemy, but into a tree line half a mile away. The observers laughed, but then noticed the deflection pattern in the dirt. It was repeatable. British ordnance officers began quietly running ricochet range tests, not for combat use, but for studying energy retention and surface reflection. Their conclusion: ricochet behavior can be predicted within narrow parameters. It is not inherently random. Meanwhile, Rains himself tried it only once more, near Mortain, when a German machine gun nest fired from behind a stone wall. He used the same principle, adjusted for hard surface deflection, and sent a shell low into the road. The round skipped off the cobblestones, shattered against the wall, and sent shrapnel raining over the position. He didn't even smile. He just told his gunner, "It still works." But the copycats didn't stop. Crews across the front tried to imitate the shot under different conditions, some with dry soil, others with gravel or snow. Most failed. One tragic test in the Hurtgen forest ended with a miscalculated deflection that detonated under friendly infantry. After that, command issued a bulletin. Ricochet fire is not an approved practice. All gunners are to observe standard line-of-sight engagement procedures. And just like that, Rain's discovery was buried again, the way armies always bury what they can't regulate. Still, the physicists kept thinking about it. The ricochet shot proved that a projectile's path wasn't fixed. Terrain could shape it. That concept would evolve, quietly, into research on indirect kinetic fire, the foundation for later experiments with deflective blast weapons and smart munitions. Decades later, when U.S. engineers were designing programmable fused shells that could detonate after penetrating cover, one of them cited a classified WW2 case labeled Controlled Deflection, Normandy, 1944. They didn't know the gunner's name. They only knew the effect. Even in defeat, the idea had endured that under the right math, the battlefield itself could be part of the weapon. And that maybe, somewhere between instinct and physics, there's a kind of aim no sighting system can replicate. Rains would never know any of this. After the war, he left the army, worked in a machine shop, and refused interviews. When a journalist tracked him down in 1961 and asked if the story was true, he said only, "I fired one shot. It went where it wanted to." But history knew better, because the ground never wants anything. It only reflects what it's given. And that day in Normandy, one gunner gave it the perfect angle. By the time the Allies reached the German border, the backward shot had already been forgotten by everyone except those who'd witnessed it. There was no medal, no commendation, not even a line in the battalion log beyond indirect fire, unexplained. The Army preferred myths that fit inside manuals, not ones that rewrote them. But in the quiet aftermath, men like Rains became part of a different story. Not of decorated heroes, but of field inventors. Soldiers who treated the battlefield as both weapon and experiment. What Rains did that day at Villers-Bocage wasn't an act of insanity or chance. It was the convergence of perception and physics. A man sinking himself to the unseen geometry of the ground beneath his feet. Historians later tried to reduce it to data points. Impact velocity, 590 merems. Deflection angle, 58 degree. Time of flight, 1.9 seconds. Energy transfer, 150 kilojoules. Numbers so perfect they read like fiction. But no number could explain why Rains had the nerve to try it. He wasn't testing a theory. He was fighting for survival, boxed in by hedgerows and closing armor. In that split second, he didn't see a hopeless situation. He saw a new variable. That's what separates chance from precision. Every soldier is taught to obey procedure. Very few realize that procedure is just a simplification of physics. And physics doesn't respect procedure, only results. Rains understood that intuitively. He saw the Earth not as obstacle, but equation. The mud wasn't ground. It was trajectory waiting to happen. That's what made the backward shot dangerous to the Army's order. It implied that instinct, not instruction, could produce better math. Engineers at Aberdeen would later prove what Rains already knew by feel. That deflection angles could be predicted and replicated under strict conditions. Their research laid the groundwork for adaptive fuse control systems, the predecessors of modern programmable shells. But no lab experiment could capture what made his moment so extraordinary. The human factor. A computer can measure. A man can anticipate. In war, that difference can move mountains. Or in Rains' case, ricochet shells. The physics was elegant. The philosophy, uncomfortable. If instinct could equal precision, then every soldier was a potential inventor. Every rule could be rewritten by necessity. Rains proved that even under the crushing logic of industrial war, humanity could still outthink machinery. He turned mud into mirror, fear into formula. He didn't change doctrine. He revealed what doctrine forgot. That war isn't a contest of straight lines. It's a conversation between chaos and those who can listen to it. The backward shot was a sentence in that conversation, a moment when randomness folded into rhythm, and rhythm became aim. When the war ended and men like Rains went home, the story lived only in whispers, a myth among mechanics, an anecdote told to new gunners. There was once a man who aimed backward and hit the future, because that's what he really did. He hit the future. The shot was more than physics. It was prophecy. It foreshadowed the age of weapons that could think, adjust, and bend their paths in flight. And yet the first to do it had no radar, no sensors, no equations, just dirt, steel, and instinct. Precision through chaos, calculation through fear. The shot that shouldn't have worked did. And that's how wars evolve. Not through inventions from laboratories, but from a single human hand turning an impossible angle into a straight line. Years later, when the story of the backwards shot resurfaced in an Army Engineering Digest, it was filed under Anomalous Engagement, Villers-Bocage, 1944. The entry was small, almost apologetic. Ricochet trajectory, one confirmed kill, non-repeatable. No names, no context. Just the raw fact of something that shouldn't have worked, but did. By then, Sergeant Michael Rains was long gone from the service. He'd gone home to Kansas, took a job repairing tractors, and refused to talk about the war. When pressed, he'd only smile and say, "Sometimes the land helps if you listen." No one understood what he meant. But the earth had spoken to him once through mud, angle, and echo. And he'd answered in the only language war allows, a single shot. The physicists later gave it terms: controlled deflection, terrain-assisted vector alignment. They built wind tunnels and soil simulators, recreated the conditions. A few shells bounced the way his did. Most didn't. But none of them could recreate the thing that mattered most, the moment between instinct and ignition. That's what no lab can measure. Because the backward shot wasn't an engineering problem. It was a human solution to chaos, one born from urgency, not theory. When you strip away the mystique, what remains is simple. A man saw geometry where others saw mud. He trusted the numbers his eyes couldn't see, and in trusting them, he redefined what aiming meant. Rains's story became more than a battlefield curiosity. It became a parable of ingenuity, proof that courage and calculation aren't opposites, but extensions of the same instinct. The war ended, the manuals were rewritten, and armies moved on to guided missiles and radar locks. Precision became mechanical, not personal. But somewhere deep in those systems, in the circuits that compute trajectories and deflection angles, lies a trace of that Normandy morning. Because the first time a weapon obeyed the earth instead of fighting it, a man pulled the trigger. Standing in that muddy lane surrounded by fire and noise, Rains didn't change history. He simply reminded it that equations are only as limited as the minds that read them. He aimed into the ground and hit an idea that war, at its core, is still a dialogue between chaos and the human capacity to make sense of it. The tiger tanks, the hedgerows, the convoys, all of them would fade. But the shot would remain, echoing through time like a perfect angle repeating itself. The earth became his mirror. The mud became his compass. And one impossible shell drew a straight line through disbelief. They laughed when he aimed backward. They stopped when the horizon caught fire, because sometimes genius doesn't look forward, it just looks elsewhere.